welcome everyone to this week's Code with Jason Meetup. Something new, if you've been watching the YouTube videos or if you've been coming to this meetup when it happens, you might notice that I have a bookshelf now. My new office is slowly coming together. Anyway, in this week's Code with Jason Meetup, we're going to do something. We've kind of done something like this before, but this is slightly different. We've had a couple meetups in the past where I've done a code review. In this one, we're going to do what you might call a live consultation with our friend Paul here. Paul's working on some code, and Paul and I are going to talk about what he's working on and share some thoughts and stuff like that. And by the way, I want to say before we get into it that the kind of thing that I'm about to do this evening is also something that I do for hire. I have clients who hire me to just talk through technical issues. We look at code together, stuff like that. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, just send me an email, jason@codewithjason.com, and we can talk about what that might look like. Anyway, let's dive right in. First of all, Paul, why don't you give us a quick intro? And if you like, you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Paul. I'm a Ruby on Rails dev. I do it professionally, and I work for a company in the DC area. I've been programming since Rails anyway, 2016. After a failed music career, I got married. Well, actually, I got married and then I had a failed music career. Really, it was just like too difficult to live life on the road away from home. And so I started looking for other things to do, and I worked in a music store for a while. And then a friend of mine said, "Hey, why don't you learn how to build websites?" And I built websites in like the 90s with copy and pasting HTML on my GeoCities and tripod sites. And so I was like, oh, okay. But I didn't really know anything about web apps or how that worked. When I was a kid, I learned BASIC and Commodore 64 or whatever their language was. And I took some, Pascal and Fortran and COBOL in high school and stuff. And but I hadn't really done anything since the 90s. So I started learning Ruby just on my own, and then started just getting into Rails and interning at my friend's business that said I should learn it. And then eventually their dev left suddenly, and he's like, can you be a dev? And I was like, of course, because it's a lot better to get paid for learning how to be a dev than to not get paid doing it. So yeah, and if you can devote 40 hours a week doing it, then you're going to learn a lot quicker. So yeah, so if you're a junior dev, you're always ready. You always say yes, you're ready, and
I thought you were going to say it's better to get paid as a developer than to get paid as a musician.
You have to get paid more,
right,
as a developer.
Yeah,
generally speaking.
One time, like 20 years ago, it was like when I was early college. I was hanging out at friend's house, and my now wife, I was like playing a keyboard or something like that, just like fucking around, and my wife was like, she was like watching me, and apparently she must have been impressed or something, because she was like, Jason, why did you major in computers? Why didn't you major in something to do with music? And I'm like, have you seen what musicians make? Like, no. Like, obviously you can make millions of dollars, but like the chances of that, it's kind of like trying to join the NBA or something. Odds of that, it's tough to scratch out a living as a musician.
Yeah, it's like living in a country that doesn't have a middle class. You got the elites, and then you got everybody that's broke. There's not a lot of ground for someone just to be a 9-to-5 musician.
Yeah. And then the lifestyle, it's not an easy lifestyle.
Yeah, you always work the nights and you always work the holidays. So
right.
Yeah. So still love you.
Yeah, c'est la vie indeed. Anyway, so what
Yeah.
are some of the things you're working on now? What do you want to talk about this evening?
Yeah. So I started working for this company last year. So it's been a little over a year. Um, is a company started about 7 or 8 years ago, from what I understand. And the guys are data science and security guys. And so they had a great idea for building an app. Um, and they're not Rails devs, but they chose Rails to build the app. And so they learned enough to make it happen. And then I think they just started with 2 or 3 people basically. And so the app just grew and grew and grew, and they needed to get all the features and needed to get everything that they wanted it to be able to do. And so now here we are, 7 years, 8 years later, and now the company's profitable and to a place where got a lot of investors and doing well. And now the app needs to be brought up to speed as far as code quality. So there's no test suite, and we're scared to break things. So this year is going to be a big focus on refactoring this thing, and it's quite large, probably in the range of what Jason would consider model classes, probably somewhere like 300, 400, somewhere in there.
Okay.
But they're not in models. They're all over the place. And service objects, they're in the lib folder, they're in models, they're in other folders that they created, that are for other business logic basically. So yeah, we're trying to obviously there's a whole lot that needs to get done. But I thought tonight would be a good opportunity to talk about something I've never think I've heard you talk about, which is like how to start building a test suite when your code when you need to refactor. So and the question I posed you in the last email was, we have controllers that are fat controllers, and we have fat models too. So it's like you got a controller that might have 200 lines in an action. How do I write a test to make sure we don't break any of that logic before we start, migrating it into more back end type classes?
Yeah. Yeah. So this whole thing is super not easy.
Yeah.
But let's get into it. So first of all, you might have already said, but like, what's the size of the team? How many developers?
We're probably around a dozen developers that are working on the client side app, or like the what our clients use. There's other back end, machine learning type folks that we somewhat interact with, but as far as just the app goes, probably about a dozen.
Okay. And if what's like the level of comfort and skill and all that with testing for the people in the team?
So we have 3 people, myself included, that are, I've got maybe 5 or 6 years Rails experience. The other 2 guys are more in like the 15 years range.
Mm-hmm.
So us 3 are probably like the best, or the most experienced Ruby people. The rest of
Mm-hmm.
them are all kind of between, like, they all have a background in JavaScript usually, or Python or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're learning Ruby. So they're all competent, and they know what they're doing as far as from a programming standpoint. But as far as Rails best practices and that kind of stuff, that's where we just have the 3 of us that are the most knowledgeable on that.
Okay. And for the people who aren't Rails people, do you know where they're at with testing?
Some of them have done JavaScript testing,
Mm-hmm.
using, I can't remember that popular one testing framework that's out there, but there's one. Yeah, Jest, that's it. So some of them have used Jest. I've heard them talk about. Some of them, we actually have some tests that are in there that are written in Python, because I guess that's the person knew how to write Python tests, and so there's some Python code in there that is part of the test suite that will probably be converted. So someone out there knows how to write Python tests, but I don't know who wrote that and how long ago it was.
Okay. Okay. And I understand that at least at one point in time there was no test suite. Is there anything as far as a test suite goes now?
No, like there's a few Python tests that are sitting in a folder somewhere, but the test suite doesn't really get run. And there's no, one of the goals is to get a CI/CD, going, and the test suite obviously is going to be a part of that, as well as some kind of linting and things of that nature. So,
Okay.
but really, there is no test suite that gets run before it deploys or anything like that.
Okay. Okay. Um, so something to consider with projects like this, and by projects like this, I mean adding tests to code bases that don't have tests. Um, the first thing that's needed is just the testing infrastructure. And so, of course, certain decisions need to be made among the team, like what test framework are we going to use, all the tooling, all that stuff. And then just that infrastructure needs to be there.
Mhm.
And again, that's something that usually requires either like consensus on the team or like buy-in from some kind of boss person who can just dictate to everybody, okay, this is what we're gonna do.
Mhm. And they
And
have decided on R spec, and there were, a few little R spec tests that had been written at some point, but no one ever used them. And when I came on board, the test suite wouldn't even run, so it threw us throwing errors, and so it was pretty much unusable. And one of the other Rails guys has gotten it working, and I have written some tests for one feature that I worked on. So like there's a couple, but nothing is covered as far as the actual legacy code that's in there. So
okay. Okay. Yeah, and I might be preaching to the choir with this, but if it were me, I would get CI set up right from the get-go so
mhm,
that so that you have that um well, it'll never be easier than it is now, and so then you can
mhm,
have that, and you can have that as part of your cycle.
yeah,
um Another thing that I think is going to be tough is if the testing skills aren't present in all the team, and
mhm,
the habits aren't there, then that's going to
mhm,
be really tough, obviously. um and I don't have any like answers for that necessarily, although maybe I have some ideas, but I did want to mention that because I think a lot of times when people get asked this question of like, how do I add tests to an existing code base, they're like, oh, just like make a rule that all new features have to have tests. And
mhm,
I don't think that's probably very realistic, because it's like you say, I don't know, it's like telling a baby like, okay, you have to ride this bike now, and it's like, well, I'm just a baby, I've never ridden a bike.
yeah.
um that kind of thing.
The previous company I worked for they were a much bigger company with a big corporate structure and everything, and they had a rule that you created a PR, and they were using GitHub, and it would run across the linters, like Code Climate and stuff like that. And if it found anything that failed the linting, then you would have to fix those things before anyone would look at your PR. But it
Hmm.
would also run the test suite, and if if you broke anything, obviously you would have to fix it. But also they did a thing where if code coverage reduced at all from your commit, then you would have to write tests to cover it so that it wouldn't reduce. So they would never allow code coverage to go down. But
Hmm.
I think that's in a pretty extreme other side of it.
Yeah, it almost feels a little bit draconian. And one
Mhm,
would hope that people just have the habits. Because, okay, for me, I never look at my test coverage metrics,
mhm,
because I think it's better to just have the habits of testing, such that you would never allow yourself to, like, you would feel like a sense of like something's not right if you didn't write tests. And I operated that
mhm,
way for a really long time at my last job, and maybe every few months I would check my test coverage, and it was like 97% or something like that. So like that way of working does work. But obviously code coverage percentages are only like a proxy, they're not a measurement of something that's actually meaningful. It's only an indirect measurement. Anyway, yeah, I just wanted to say those kind of couple meta things, but now that I've said that, anything specific we want to dive into now?
Yeah. So I've read a little bit about, people mention the Working with Legacy Code book. Um, I've not read that book, but I have read, blogs talking about some of the concepts in the book that were relevant to kind of what our situation is. They talked about kinds of tests. I can't remember the term for it, but some kind of encapsulation test or something along those lines, where you can kind of like write a test to not necessarily knowing, like writing, say you've got like a 50 line method, and you know that it out, if I put in these things and it's going to output this stuff, we can kind of get some basic behavior in a test in that way. So I was
Yeah.
thinking something like that might be there to put in place initially, to kind of just be an easy safeguard. It's not going to be fully, check everything, but
Yeah, Jonathan just put what I was going to say,
oh
which is
yeah,
characterization tests. I think that's what you're talking
that's what
about.
it is. That is what it is. That's the term.
Yeah. Side note, I just remembered
Mhm.
a meta comment that I wanted to make with my other comments, which is that adding tests to existing code, in my opinion, is a distinct skill from just testing in general. And just because a person knows how to test doesn't necessarily mean that they have that skill of adding tests to existing code. It's a different, and I think much harder skill. I'm just saying that for expectation setting. But yeah,
Mm.
with characterization tests, I think that's a really good way to go. I've done that a lot myself. Sometimes I do something I call reverse TDD. If the code already exists, it's too late to do TDD, obviously, but
Mhm.
you can like comment out the entire body of a function, for example, and then oh, Roger, yeah, I'll get to you in a second. Yeah, thanks. Um, you can comment out the body of a function and then write a test that fails but passes when the first line is uncommented.
Mm.
And then I'll
Okay.
just go down and do that for the entire file. And it's basically the same. It's the same exact spirit and same mechanics of if I start with no code and write tests and then write code that makes those tests pass. It just so happens that
Right.
instead of writing that code out of nowhere, I'm uncommenting a pre-existing line to make it pass, but it still achieves the same thing of ensuring that every line is covered.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think that's great. Yeah,
That's a
Roger,
good
you wanted to
idea.
add something.
Mine was just an operational thing that I'd personally experienced. Paul, I just wanted to
Hmm.
say I've been on the last two teams. One of them, their testing was like brand new to old software. And I think there's two problems that have nothing to do with what Jason's talking about, like that are like those are technical, like you know what I mean? These are just human
Hmm.
problems. One is people are really scared to be the first people to write tests on like code like that. So there's just that human problem. And then the second
Yeah.
part of that human problem is like what's the like culture of psychological safety with regards to doing it. So what we did, because the person who brought me in is a really awesome leader, and what he basically said right off the bat was everybody, we have to do all sort of like a basic set of tests like to get started, right? Like
Yeah.
you know what I mean, like does this work, like basic stuff, right? And he said the best way is to do that, but to do that in pairs so that
Mm.
there's no like there you have lots of psychological safety. You're a lot of humility because you can see like other people don't know stuff. It's not you that screwed up, it's these kinds of things. And I think that really did a lot for the culture, and we ended up getting
Mm.
a lot done. And because every week you rotated with somebody new pairing, people became better at pairing, better at writing tests, and also the tests just kept getting better. The quality kept going up because everybody knows more about something than you do. So anyway, that was just something that I think really helped to change the culture, and that's
Yeah.
what I want. That's all I wanted to share.
Yeah, that's great thoughts, great advice. Yeah, and we'll often pair up a little bit with the Rails people and some of the people that are more, have backgrounds in other languages, and that's been helpful. Um, so yeah, I think that's something I hadn't thought about. That's a great idea though. Thank you.
That reminds me, that and your question about characterization testing, Paul, reminds me of another comment I wanted to make. There's often the question of where do we start? When we have no tests at all, where do we start? And again, some of the common advice is start with what's most valuable. And that's kind of
Mm,
logical, but often what's most valuable is also the most complicated and the most difficult to test. And so that's maybe not a great place to start. So my opinion is just start with what's easiest.
mm,
Because again, it all depends on like the team's level of comfort with testing. If a large portion of the team has no experience with testing and they need to like just get their feet wet and start to get some practice, there's like two desired outcomes. There's like, we want tests for the application, and also we need to build skills in these people.
mhm,
And I would invite the team to consider that maybe they don't need to always achieve both those goals at the same time. And so
mm,
maybe you could be writing tests, and with the idea that the test you're writing, you're gonna commit them to the code base, but you're not worried about if the tests are actually going to be all that valuable for the intended purpose. You're just trying to get practice writing some kind of test. And then the other part of that is like, again, for these high value areas of the code, it's probably going to require a lot of like setup data and stuff like that. There's probably a lot of intertangled dependencies and stuff like that. It's going to be really difficult to test. But if you start with these easier areas, you can kind of develop a beachhead with that setup data and stuff like that.
mhm.
Um, and expand outwardly from there. Because like if you try to go straight to that complex stuff, it might be so hard that it's practically impossible. But if you start with those other areas and expand outward, eventually you'll expand big enough to encompass those more complicated things gradually.
Right, right. And yeah, and I like that. And I know we're using FactoryBot on the few tests that I wrote for a feature a couple months ago. That's what we use to create some objects to use for testing. So we've got that in place already. And but yeah, that's good advice. And yeah, I know a lot of the people probably haven't done a lot of testing, writing tests, especially the people that have been there over a year, because nobody's written any tests in a year then. So that yeah, get it starting simple. And I see the comment from Jack there about high churn, low complexity. And we're using Skunk to evaluate the code base and see like what's got high churn, and code smells and over complex and yeah and all that. So we have in mind like some stuff that are those areas already. And that kind of brings me back to the question I asked initially, last month, I think it was, when I first asked this question on your meetup, and it kind of led to this was, should we write tests first to cover the code base and then start refactoring? Should we refactor and then write tests to the refactored code, or somewhere in the middle? And my initial feeling was that the amount of time it would take to write tests for all this code base, which has a lot of copy and pasted pancake code all around it, lots of duplicated code, waste a lot of time writing a bunch of tests that are really unnecessary. If it was refactored to, I imagine this code base could be refactored to a third of the size of what it is now. That means we're writing 3 times the tests that we need to. So that was the initial question I asked. And so yeah, that's kind of where we, another reason we're thinking like writing the characterization tests and then start to refactor and write tests for the refactored code was kind of feels like a good way to approach, like a 50-50. What do you think about that?
Good question. So one way of thinking about it is like, how could I possibly be okay with refactoring something that doesn't have tests? Because then how would I know that it's not going to break? On the other hand, it sure would be nice to live in a world where you could just take the whole app and refactor it down to a third of its size and then write tests for that. It'd be much more efficient. Obviously, that's not realistic. But what I would say is, like, in cases when you can refactor something and then write tests after, sure. But I wouldn't be particularly hopeful that there's going to be a high number of those. Maybe that's like 1% of the time is something that's trivial enough where you would feel safe doing that. Sadly, the whole thing is kind of a chicken egg problem where it's hard to write tests before you refactor it, but you don't want to refactor it until there's tests. It's just a hard thing, and there's not really any way around it.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of what I was feeling too. And in responding to Jonathan about multiple environments, we do have test servers, multiple test servers where we can deploy code to test out. And then we have a staging server where that server shares the live data. It has basically a copy of the live data, and we use that staging server also for some of our clients to beta test stuff. So it's kind of like our process is to deploy to the test servers and manually test things. And then when we feel like it's there, then we deploy to the staging server and test it with the live data and make sure it's working. Our testing data on the test servers leaves plenty to be desired. So, not everything is really testable with it. So once it gets on the staging server, then you really can see how it's going to work in production. So that's kind of our process right now. We don't have a QA team, so it's the devs and our product manager basically that test. So the devs definitely have incentives to write tests, because then we don't have to hopefully spend as much time manually testing stuff on test servers and things like that. So but yeah, what you said, Jason, is like kind of what I thought too. It's like, it's not realistic to refactor the whole code base. It's not realistic to rewrite the code, so we've got but it's not realistic to write, fully tested tests for everything right now. And, because that would be so inefficient. It would take us 2 years to write a test suite before we could start refactoring. So it's going to be somewhere in between, I think. So that's where I think characterization tests may be helpful, because we already manually test everything. That's already the process, so that's still going to happen. But if we can do it and our thoughts are, we're going to try to do section by section throughout the code base this year, and is refactor it, get test coverage on it. So, but yeah, it'd be nice to have something in place to at least kind of, just be a blanket catch for things. And what do you think about I think Rails calls them system tests, and different people call them different things, but where it's basically using a headless browser to test the website. I know they take a long time to run and stuff. Do you think something like that might be useful in this scenario?
Oh yeah, I definitely think it's an essential part of the picture. Because if you don't have system tests, there's nothing that ensures that everything's all working together. And so I see those as indispensable. And the way I approach that is like a relatively small number of coarse-grained system tests and a relatively large number of fine-grained, what I'll call unit tests, but just everything that's not a system test, a larger number of those finer grained tests. That's kind of how I'd do that.
And how about, I know that it's kind of controversial, not in like a aggressive way or anything, but controller tests, you see people have opinions either way on whether they're even worth writing or you should always write them. How do you feel about something like that?
Yeah, I used to not write many controller tests, and now I write a little more than I used to. Oh, sorry, I just noticed there's like a hand up. Zoom has a hand icon. Who is that? I can't click it. I can't tell. Oh, okay, that is
Mhm.
Jack. Yeah, go ahead, Jack. I have no idea how long you've had your hand up. I apologize.
No worries. So I just wanted to ask Paul, one thing that can drastically change how you approach this is how much buy-in do you have from the business side of things? Are
Mm.
they willing to essentially stop progress on new features in order to do the test suite and the refactoring? Or are
Mm.
they still going to expect you to maintain pace on features
Mm-hmm. Sure.
and add the
Yeah,
tests?
that's a great question, and this is and that is very important in every situation I've ever been in. From where I was building MVPs with no test suites because the clients spend money on it, and to like the other side where I'm in a company that's extremely concerned about having everything covered. That the management is real important. Thankfully, last year was our feature year where we built all the features that they feel like we mainly need. We get requests from clients, hey, we'd love your app to be able to do this. Okay, let's build the feature. And we've kind of got a interesting situation where we allow our clients to create Jira tickets for us of feature requests and stuff. So it's kind of cool. So there's um, so we I think the management feels like we're at a place now where we've got the features we need um for the software to be in a good place, and the investors are happy with what it provides. We're just finishing up like basically a switching the front end to make it look more like in a material design style, so a more modern looking front end versus it basically looked like the old Rails blogs everywhere, so with some JavaScript thrown in around. um so they're happy with, once that finishes up probably this month, then they want to start going to refactoring because they plan on bringing more devs in this year. And we've been telling them, you don't want to, it's going to make it be a lot easier if we can have some stuff refactored before the devs touch it and have to try to figure all this out and spend all that time digging through this code to see what it does. So, which is what we've all gone through. So yeah, management is on board, thankfully, and our project manager is kind of put a multiple point strategy to refactor the code base. So it's definitely moved up to the top of the list for priorities, thankfully.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jack. I'm glad you brought that up. Back to the controller tests. By the way, the terminology has changed. RSpec used to call them controller tests. Now they used to call them controller specs. Now they call them request specs. So there's kind of three scenarios where I use request specs. One scenario is when I'm working on a legacy project where they have a lot of code in controllers, and it's just more practical, to write request specs to test that code that way than to exercise that code via a system spec or something like that. Another scenario is when I'm working on an API project that doesn't have a UI. And then the third scenario is when it's too awkward or costly to write a system spec for something, then I drop down and write a request spec. Maybe there's, I don't remember. I'm going off of a blog post I wrote a long time, so I looked it up. I'm like, oh, apparently this is what I think about this. But yeah, if there are like some aspect to the UI that makes that system spec hard to write, then I'll consider dropping down to the request spec level and writing it there.
That sounds good. Yeah. What I was wondering also is, we want to move code out of controllers into business logic, move that business logic into model files. And I think I've kind of got everybody on board with the way that you've described organizing code that you like, which is everything's a model basically, and using poros, plain old Ruby objects, and using name spacing to organize in different folders and whatnot, a structure in that way. So, we've kind of started to do, I've started to do some of that with any of the new features stuff that I've built. I basically have used that kind of way. So, we don't want to break the code in the controllers, when we move it to the models. And that's where I was wondering if you have any ideas on how we could test that code before it gets, moved.
I do. Before I answer, Jonathan, did you have a comment?
So this is actually taking one step back. So, and this is kind of the direction I was going with my question about multiple environments. Then someone else had mentioned feature tests. Because you have multiple environments, you don't have to worry about blowing up stuff outside. I've been on ones where the Stripe account is used everywhere. So if you're running in dev or if you're running in production, don't touch the wrong thing. But you don't have to worry. If you don't have to worry about that, feature tests are a nice way to quickly write tests that are kind of your characterization style thing. I click this button, I click this button, I click this button, and it's going to say, account setup or whatever. And you don't need to know how it's doing it, what it's doing, or whatnot. And that gives you, but it does give you safety, because if you click, and you don't get an account, then something's broken. So that's a good way to get lots of test coverage. But primarily it's about getting test coverage over stuff that's critical.
Gotcha. Okay.
And they're typically pretty easy to write for that critical stuff.
Okay. I don't know if I fully follow everything that you're describing, but maybe I can do. Is feature test kind of like the general term for these?
Yeah, this could be your system test. So with our spec, that would be a feature test. So that's that high level headless browser type setup.
Right. Yeah. I've only done that on using mini test with like the web drivers, that kind of thing. So I haven't done it with our spec, but it's probably similar, I imagine.
I think that they both use Capybara behind the scenes, so that a lot of it's going to be very similar, anyways. And really, it's your test code is going to read similar to visit the homepage, clicked on sign up, fill in username, password, click sign up, and there's an alert that says your account's been created. And if that doesn't give you that on the page, then you've broken up sign in. Somehow you've broken sign up.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's that. I've written those kind of tests before, just in using mini tests. So it's probably the same kind of, and using Capybara, and we used VCR as well for API stuff. So and those work great. They're just a bit slow. So, but that's why you were saying, Jason, you try to write more unit tests and just write what's necessary as far as system tests, I imagine.
Regarding the moving logic out of controllers into models, that kind of thing, I do have some thoughts. This is another area where Michael Feathers has some good ideas. He has a couple techniques he calls extract method and extract class, where if you have like, one example is like you have a method that's like 100 lines long or something like that, but it's kind of entangled with some other dependencies and stuff like that. You don't want to change that class. You can at least grab that chunk of 100 lines and move it, for example, into its own new class. And now you have this isolated thing that's now separated from the dependencies of the original class that was in, and you can test that more easily. but you didn't have to make any drastic changes. And so it gets around that chicken egg problem of like, I want to add tests to this, but I can't add tests to it before I change the code because the code has too many entangled dependencies. That's one way of getting around that. As far as getting code out of a controller and into a model, you might be able to do something like that. Often I find that there's no way around it, and you just have to do the grunt work to get like decent test coverage on the controller action that you want to refactor. And then once you feel like you've reached that threshold where you have enough coverage to give you confidence, then you can move it. Because it's not as easy usually as like, oh, this code in the controller is just, it's great as it is. It's just in the wrong place. I want to move it over here. Usually like names are inaccurate and it's hard to understand, and like things are all tangled up. And so it's not like, oh, I just want the same code, but in a different place. But like, I just need this to be something entirely different, or else it's not even worth spending the time on. And so those are the cases where there's just no way around it. You just have to write the test to cover all the code that's there.
Gotcha. Yeah. Do you know, I don't have really hardly any experience with writing controller tests. Can you know, and one of the things that that we'd want to test is, this is one of the problems with the code base too, is a lot of these actions might create 8 or 9 different instance variables that are used in the view. So one of the things that we'd want to test would be, are all these instance variables the correct values, things like that. Is that something that's easy to do in a controller test?
My memory is, yeah, you can pretty easily check those values. But I'll say a couple things. One is that for that test coverage that would precede the refactoring, I would probably achieve that through a mix of request specs and system specs. And the benefit of doing the system specs is that they're loosely coupled from the implementation. So checking values of individual variables is probably not something I would be inclined to do, because that's very tightly coupled with the implementation. I would want to test the broader behavior instead, so that then I could freely change the implementation without having to change the tests. And I don't know whether I would gravitate toward more request specs or more system specs, probably more system specs. But yeah, in any case, I'd try to test the broader stuff so I could refactor freely.
Yeah. And the way I would imagine it's like, I think the system specs, like you said, they wouldn't, you write them and they're not going to change because the behavior would stay the same regardless. Whereas, when we refactor these controllers, we'll probably be in a combination of refactoring the views as part of that and eliminating all these extra variables that are being set and using probably some kind of like object oriented solution, that could handle that better. So the controller specs would probably be more just to like characterization tests, where we just want to make sure the behavior stays the same. And then if we remove a variable, we can remove that in the spec or something like that, I imagine. But yeah, I don't have much experience with controller tests or request specs, so that'll be something new for me to learn, dig into. So.
Yeah, it took me a bit to get into the hang of those. It's kind of a lot of the same concepts, but then there's new concepts too, because like you invoke it by making a request, and the kinds of assertions you make might have something to do with like a certain response code was given and stuff like that, rather than like a value equaling a certain thing or something like that. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
request specs are not what I would steer beginners toward, people who are new to testing,
Yeah,
because it's not the easiest kind.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. I'm just imagining some of those actions, what, like, the params you send to these actions would definitely drastically change what your values would be in your variables and things like that.
Mm.
And some of these are Ajax calls made by jQuery data tables, or high charts, JavaScript stuff. There's stuff that's lazy loaded, so there's some actions that are for that purpose. So yeah, it's got a wide variety of stuff in there.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds hard.
Yeah. So it'll be fun. But yeah, so looking forward to it. I like refactoring personally. I like trying to improve it and make it. I want to be able to write good software. I've always, it makes me happy. I love running RuboCop and fixing all the little things, even if I don't always agree with them.
Yeah, refactoring can obviously be really satisfying, to take something that's hard to understand, make it easy to understand, make your own life a little bit easier. It's very satisfying.
Mm.
Okay, well, we only have a few more minutes in our hour, but anything else?
I feel like this has been really helpful, and I appreciate everybody's thoughts and sharing them with me. And yeah, and then hopefully it'll definitely make a difference in everything. And I'll share this video with everybody on the team too, so
Oh
they
yeah.
can watch it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and thanks for doing this. I was telling my wife, I'm so happy that we're doing this meetup tonight the way we are. It means I don't have to prepare a presentation like I normally do. I just answer some questions and stuff like that. But aside from that, it's great to have like real world examples and like questions that arise from real projects and stuff like that. It's not just me guessing what people want to hear about and stuff like that. These are real questions coming from somebody who's working on a project. And so I really appreciate you being willing to come here and share your scenario and your questions and stuff like that. It's helpful to me, and I'm sure that it's helpful to other people, because if you have these questions, obviously other people have the same questions too. So this, I hope it helps a lot of people.
Absolutely. And I've had these kind of questions from 2 jobs ago that I was in, and where we were in the same kind of boat. So yeah. And yeah, but I was only, I'd only been doing it for a year or two at that point. So I was barely just trying to figure out what to do, and just writing code. So I didn't really have the brain space available at that point to think about testing and all that. So
Yeah.
I kind of just, I just kind of hit the ground running when I got into this. I really didn't have much experience. And when I started my first job, I didn't even, I think maybe I had like 8 months of interning, like 5 or 6 hours a week, and then I just started as a dev, as the only Rails dev on the team. So, and it's kind of just been like that for the first 3 years. I think probably it's just kind of flying by the seat of my pants, trying not to break things too bad.
Yeah, I think that's the way it often goes. That describes me early on, certainly. All right. Well, Paul, thanks again, and thanks to everybody else for joining. And I will see you guys next time.
Yeah, appreciate you, Jason. You're I listen to every one of your podcasts when they come out. I find them
thank you.
very helpful, and I read all your blogs too. I just think the way you explain things, it makes a lot of sense, and it's easy to understand, and yeah, really appreciate your efforts that you put into it.
Oh, well, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. All right, I better go before I start tearing up. That really All right. Talk to you guys later.
Yeah, take care. And if anyone wants to meet, just send me a thing on LinkedIn if you want to link up at all. So I know I saw a couple people. So
Awesome.
good times.
All right. Talk to you guys later.